Welcome to the Josh Button Podcast, where we discuss health, wellness, and outliers from society. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the Josh Button Podcast. Today is episode 70, and I have Mr. Justin Leslie on today. And if you're not familiar, we have a barn burner with all kinds of information that just might blow your mind. And we're going to start by saying that he has a 2-part documentary you really want to go see, integrity.net. Highly recommend going and watching it, going and absorbing all of this firsthand. But then, we're going to try and cover our bases here. Justin, please introduce yourself. Tell us, your background, where you went, what you went to college for, what you were studying, and what turned you on to all of this in the very beginning of the pandemic.
Josh, thank you so much for giving me a platform, having me on, share my story with your audience. And it's a really long journey I've been on. So in regards to my education, my bachelor's was in pharmaceutical sciences at the University of Rhode Island. And the reason I wanted to get into pharmaceuticals was ultimately to work on doing research for rare diseases. And, I was definitely a big critical thinker going through pharmaceutical school. I didn't necessarily buy into vaccines and wasn't taking them myself, So that was happening 2016 through 2020 is when I graduated college. So I finished my last semester of school at URI on Zoom University style of doing classes online. And that's really where the whole agenda started trickling in, and I was questioning everything, with masks and everything else. I complied for 2 weeks like everybody else did. And then I was like, wait a second here. What are we doing? So I couldn't find a job out of college at University of Rhode Island. And so I was applying to jobs while simultaneously looking into a master's program at Rutgers University, which is a master's of biomedical sciences. And I ultimately wanted to just do research in drug discovery, essentially, with a professor who works there, and I've been on, Alex Zech's podcast, The Way Forward. He's like, that's a noble thing to do, especially when you believe in what you're doing. It's not like I was going in there with any poor intentions, right? This is just the reality that we've been presented. And so one thing led to another. I was doing Zoom University again in this master's program. And then I ultimately was miserable doing this Zoom University style. And I ultimately wanted to see what I could do in the workforce. And so I really didn't want to work for any of the vaccine manufacturers, Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, etc. I didn't want to work for them, but that's the field that I was in. I was in pharmaceuticals. So they were prime candidates essentially to hire me. So a contract offer interview with Pfizer and then several other companies all around the same time period. And I nonchalantly did this interview with Pfizer. I thought there was no way that they were going to offer me this job. I thought it was too important to be working on this mRNA product, which we can get into. And they offered me the job after 2 interviews, and I just was blown away. I didn't really know what to do or say when the recruiter called me back. And I said, give me 24 hours. And I also wanted to know if I needed to take the vaccine in order to work there. And they said, no, not yet, at least. Right. And so I was offered a job opportunity at Pfizer as a formulation analytical scientist working directly on the COVID-19 vaccine, as well as their other mRNA platforms in early March of 2021. So the vaccines were already going into people's arms at that point in time, but I was conscious to what was going on. I was paying attention to the alternative media cycles, like what Project Veritas was putting out, what Alex Jones on InfoWars is putting out, and all the critical thinkers that we look at in a way, or at the time we're looking at for help, for advice in certain ways. I was paying attention to those outlets, and I knew that these vaccines were not safe or effective for COVID-19. That one thing led to another. And so I was a formulation analytical scientist. And then ultimately my journey leads me into getting into investigative journalism and really exposing the alternative media. Like David Icke calls it, actually, he calls this the mainstream alternative media industrial complex, the mammoth. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but I've used that on several interviews, and hopefully one day I do connect with David Icke about this story. But it was a long journey, and it ultimately culminated in James Okeefe, who is the king of investigative journalism, going to Bohemian Grove. And when he essentially confronted me, confronting him, it was like this weird resignation phone call that I had with him. And he basically was like, are you with me? Do you trust me? You know, it sounds like you don't trust me. And I'm like, dude, you went to Bohemian Grove. Like, how can I trust you? And he said it's like not exactly the conspiracy theory that Alex Jones makes it out to be and everything else. And he said that there was like some sort of business funding, or it seemed like that. So that's it in a nutshell.
Well,
and we can get into it all.
Let's definitely get into that, but let's go back further then. Let's go to when you initially started questioning COVID itself, the isolation of the virus, that you were actually there formulating a mRNA platform or anything else like that other people were suggesting to utilize to fight this virus.
So for me, I certainly started questioning the existence of COVID-19 itself, and I ultimately was subscribing to it's the flu rebranded. Probably for a majority of my time at Pfizer, I was like, okay, it's just the flu rebranded. It's just the flu rebranded. And ultimately, really, it's this like gradual awakening story of just really awakening to virology being a complete and utter pseudoscience. And the thing with me is that I did cell culture in my undergraduate studies, so I have experience with these pipettes and dealing with cells and seeing cytopathic effect on how it plays out naturally. Like cells will just have CPE if they're not treated the right way. And CPE is cytopathic effect. There's a really nitty gritty science in trying to understand methodologies. And this is kind of piggybacking actually off of your conversation with Mark Ober is how deep the rabbit hole goes in the sense of making this so confusing that the common man is not really going to be able to understand this. So someone like myself who has experience in cell culture and these other assays might be able to open people's eyes to the whole virus not even existing narrative, where essentially the Terrain camp has to be saying that there is no proof of the existence of these viruses. And I don't have an exact date for you, but I would say that it was right around the time of me leaving Pfizer in April of 2022 and me actually going to work at Project Veritas about a month later is when I really was digging into the entire thing and really grasping it as a reality. And probably simultaneously around the same time of the end of COVID coming out, I was friendly with Alex Zek actually at the time, and I would have contributed to the end of COVID, but I was in the middle of like doing this double agent thing for humanity, like seeing James Okeefe and Project Veritas through a lens that nobody else really would have access to or would. So that's just how the story goes. So I hope that answers your question.
For sure. And I'll have several off of the back of that because there's a lot of information to unpack there. When you were at Pfizer and when you were going through this initial thought process, did you actually take a step back and steel man both sides and look at the possibilities or the reasoning that most of the people within Pfizer at your level, below your level, even somewhat above your level would believe what they were doing was the right thing and that there was a model for success to be had here? Or were you really thinking that there was malice involved on the base ground line level?
That's a really interesting, and I mean, I have to figure out how I'm going to answer that. I would say that 99% of the people that I was working with had good intentions. I in my heart don't feel like, if you go to watch my documentary, my manager, Conwell Gill, the head of the analytical team that I was a part of, I was on a small scale manufacturing team doing assays, and, she's this very kind lady from India, and she has, she was just trying to help and work on an analytical team and help us run stuff so that we could get this product out to the masses. It's not like she was a vice president level or the CEO of Pfizer who wasn't taking the shot. Like, this lady I believe, from my understanding and going back in the conversations in my head, she was willingly taking these shots where, I myself remain unvaccinated and I was questioning the whole thing. So she was ultimately buying into it. I give Conwell the benefit of the doubt, although there are certain conversations with the select few, such as Ramin Davari or Nick Warren, who are also in the film. I don't give them the benefit of the doubt right away. I haven't spoken with them, so I can't really tell. But I think it's entirely possible that those guys knew that something was wrong with the way that myocarditis was prevalent, and they were just pushing the vaccines to get injected into kids for money, basically, And that's another thing, is that Pfizer was incentivizing people essentially to look the other way, especially if you were a director level, or if you were certainly a vice president, you were making multiple six figures probably at that point, and money talks. And I mean, people got to put food on the table for their families. And, looking back, hindsight is 2020, but in the moment, we were in such a hysterical moment in human history that it's really hard to point the finger now too, because people are indoctrinated. They believe in the virus. They believe that they're doing the right thing. And yes, we need to hold them accountable too, but also give them some grace in the sense that mistakes certainly were made, but we can't make these same mistakes again and allow people to just continue poisoning themselves either. So they need to be called out for what they did wrong and hold them accountable, notice of liability in a sense, but it needs to stop too.
Yeah, I totally got that vibe from that section of your documentary when you were questioning her, and you could tell that her intentions were good, but maybe that you were kind of on the go. I forget the exact terminology you used, but you used good terminology. It was working with something that's already in the field. And I can understand the reality that most of the people that have good intentions that go into this are actually just believing studies and science that's been accepted for a long period of time without ever going back or needing or thinking they had a need to go back and inspect that and see if it really lined up for them the way that it should. So with that said, there's also this layer of thought, especially in pharmaceuticals and vaccines, that there's going to be a certain amount of injury, and that is for the greater good of all of the general population. So I'm torn on this subject. That's one of the reasons I'm fascinated to speak to you, because you were inside those buildings, you were working in this network. And did you ever actually, like, after the fact, go back and actually start to draw those lines, like, oh, this person was totally probably good intentioned and probably just accepted the science before and really thought they were doing the right thing? And then, like you said, there was two people that you didn't really speak with, that you didn't necessarily give the benefit of the doubt. Those light bulbs go off for you on the latter, stages of investigation, or?
Yeah, in real time too, actually. And it's not to attack these men. It's more or less just observing the conversations that were had. If you go into my documentary, Ramin Davari and I had a conversation essentially about, and this was a real world example where my mom's friend's mother had taken the Pfizer booster shot. And I used that to elicit him on the fact that she actually collapsed within it was anywhere from 4 to 12 hours. I'm not sure the exact time frame, but she took the jab and she collapsed in her bathroom and died. And so that was a real world thing that happened through my mother. And so I just used it to elicit information out of Ramin while I was obtaining information on the inside. We had this really interesting conversation where he said that there were zillions of vaccine adverse events that were essentially being reported every single day. It's not our job to worry about this. Basically, put your head down, Justin, is what that was all about. And then I said, okay, well, what happens when, other companies don't mandate the vaccine? But that's what my next solicitation was. And he said, well, how did chip companies react when you say chips are bad for you? Are you going to get mad? Of course, right? And then he ultimately linked eating chips in extensive amounts, large amounts, to heart disease, and how chip companies are aware of heart issues linked to their chips. And I'm like, this is such a crazy correlation to the fact that people are dropping dead, and you're making a chip company correlation with your heart. And then he said, and I'm going to die from eating too many chips, and engineering the chips, which ultimately are the vaccines. And in the context of how it relates back to big pharma, we're going to engineer them in a way so that people keep on taking the next one, which is really interesting regarding their booster shot agenda, right? Because they're like you lost immunity from the first two that didn't work, so you need another. So is Ramin innocent? I'm not sure. Is he ultimately just indoctrinated in his programming? That's entirely possible, but it seems like there could be some malicious intent in the sense that, we're just going to look the other way, make our billions, and deal with it after the fact, like deal with lawsuits after the fact if we had to. And then there's another conversation I had with Nick Warren, the vice president of biotherapeutics and pharmaceutical sciences at Pfizer at the time. And he was so profound at Pfizer that he was at the VRBAC meeting for the childhood vaccine approval for 5 to 11-year-olds, where he had to follow up on answering questions from Dr. Bill Gruber, who was the senior vice president for vaccine clinical trials worldwide at Pfizer. And so Nick was his right-hand man and ultimately said this on a public forum. So yes, this is public information, but this was like an 8-hour YouTube video that who in their right mind is going to go sit and watch that, spend the whole day watching a YouTube video like I did. I watched the whole thing and I was like, this is crazy, because he admits that essentially the FDA and Pfizer came together and they said, we're going to do this bioequivalence agreement. And for the audience to understand what's going on is there were 2 different formulations that were to be considered for the approval of the Pfizer vaccine. There was the PBS, phosphate buffer saline, which was injected into kids, I believe, in clinical trials, right? That one went through clinical trials, and it could only be stored at minus 80 degrees Celsius. There was the Tris buffer, which was approved for this VRBAC meeting due to this bioequivalence agreement between the FDA and Pfizer, where they changed the last step of the formulation. They changed the buffer system, which ultimately is what allowed flexibility for pharmacists, doctors, nurses all around the country and even the world to not have to store this drug product, in a minus 80 degrees Celsius freezer. And it can be stored in like a walk-in refrigerator or just a refrigerator in general at 2 to 8 degrees Celsius. So that to me was the biggest red flag, that they're essentially doing this to cover their butt. They're like, we can point to the fact that they did the trials for the old one. The formulation was the same except for this last step, and we were in such a rush to put this into people because, this invisible virus that nobody's ever isolated is killing people. And we just, this whole YouTube video, it's 8 hours long, like I'm mentioning. Like Steve Kirsch went on there and he totally ripped them a new one on just how these vaccines were essentially murdering people. And so shout out to Steve. He had me on his show, and I know some people have disagreements with Steve because he might not be fully on board with the virology thing right now, but got to give him some grace in the sense that he has done a lot of good work in awakening people to, vaccines causing autism and other things of that nature. So,
yeah, 2-part on that. Steve Kirsch went and testified before, I believe it was Pennsylvania State, and the testimony he gave comparing the Amish to the general population was brilliant. Regardless of what his beliefs are on virology and any of that, I do commend his willingness to come forward and to actually speak those things, because as we know, you do face an incredible backlash. And then 2, what a bunch of mental gymnastics on the part of insiders to justify putting their product onto market because other products are on the market that are damaging, and B, to not build the infrastructure to deliver it the same way they did in testing. And that's mind-boggling. And like you said, it is a giant red flag from the get-go. So you're in this state of mind, you see these things. What was the light bulb that said, you know what, I'm going to be a whistleblower, I'm going to tell the truth here?
So at that point, when I was having these conversations, I was already a whistleblower per se, just undercover. And so my timeline essentially with Project Veritas starts prior to me even actually accepting the job, where I reached out to them and said, hey, I want to be a whistleblower basically and help take down Pfizer because I'm getting this job opportunity. And they said, Justin, we can't tell you what to do. If you come across newsworthy information, sure, you take the job, please reach out to us. So I said, okay, I'll take the job. And, I also basically promised my mom if I was going to do this master's program part-time that I would find a job. And so that's how that all worked out. So 6 months into the role, working as a scientist, paying attention to, like I was saying earlier, the alternative media cycles, and just knowing that this injection is injuring and harming and killing people in real time was really heavy on my heart, because I knew something was wrong. So that's why I reached out to PV again, Project Veritas, in, I believe it was late August. And then I actually connected with them in person in late September after I reached out to them after Jody O'Malley had a whistleblower story where she's a nurse from HHS. She reached out to PV and they did a huge full-blown testimony, and she exposed what was going on in the vaccines in hospitals in Arizona. And ultimately, after that story comes out, James Okeefe is out there saying, if you're in one of these big pharma companies, reach out to us at veritastips@protonmail.com. So surely I did. And then I got on the phone with some journalists, and they handed me the cameras the very next day after having a phone call with them. I met a journalist at a restaurant in Massachusetts and strapped me up right then and there. And basically I went through some coaching that night with some other journalists, and one thing leads to another, and I was ready to rock and roll the next day. It's just they failed to inform me that I was doing something technically in state statutes that was illegal, which was recording without consent. So they had me doing this for about 3 months, and they neglected to tell me about recording consent laws the entire time. I was 23 years old. I lean into the naive aspect of, who tells anybody about recording consent laws? James Okeefe is not out there educating the public about recording consent laws until pretty much after all this has happened with me. And I mean, we can get into when I was at OMG. He's coming in with this master class on educating people how to be citizen journalists and how not to break two-party consent laws and things of that nature. But it's all in hindsight, in the sense that, why did they give me all these cameras and strap me up, coach me up, in the sense of really teaching me how to elicit information with people, how to be friendly, how to elicit information, and just be somebody's best friend, essentially, to get them to tell you things that they're not comfortable saying or may not be comfortable saying if you were just stonewalled. So that all leans into the fact that I started working with them in October. The content that we talked about discussing my manager, Conwell Gill, was very powerful, combined with the conversation with Ramin Davari was very powerful. Conversation with Nick Warren, the vice president, is powerful. So those three things combined, money gain, vice president, the whole thing with the chip company is very powerful. And Conwell even said that Albert Bourla and Ugur Sahin, the CEO of BioNTech, right, the company that was working with Pfizer overseas on this formulation, they essentially had no idea, both CEOs had no idea how this efficacy was actually going to play out. Where in real time, if you go to the timestamps of news cycles, they were at like the 99 to 95% efficacy at that point in time, saying, oh yeah, if you take this, you're not going to get COVID. Well, all of that was already obtained. And I also did a microscope expose with Dr. Carrie Madej, which is also really eye-opening as to what I saw, in the sense of, and I say this on in the documentary film, is that like what I observed that night in regards to like the live blood analysis with the vaccine, right? Like we put blood on a slide, and we put the vaccine on the blood, and it coagulated within 20 to 40 seconds. It was really eye-opening, mind-blowing. Like I was pretty much in tears actually when I went back to my hotel room. I was like, this thing is a murder weapon. And I like was praying to God. I was like, there's no way that Project Veritas is not going to tell a story, right? And sure enough, my heart was ripped out from my chest about a month later. 5-6 weeks after that, early December, is when James Okeefe and Project Veritas said, Justin, we're not going to tell your story, because if we tell your story, you're going to go to jail. You're a felon, you're a criminal. This FBI raid happened that to me is potentially part of a huge counterintelligence operation against me. And that is essentially, I'm not affirming that. I'm essentially just asking massive questions here, because this FBI raid that occurred was supposedly having to do with Ashley Biden's diary, which was a story that Project Veritas was investigating in October of 2020. Well, why did they wait over a year to raid 2 journalists and James Okeefe for that long? And there's also an anomaly where when the FBI raids somebody, there's a 99+% conviction rate. I think in percentage is like 99.6% conviction rate. Then how did James and the 2 journalists, Spencer Meads and Eric Cochran, not get convicted of anything during this raid? And, they made such a big deal about this on Fox News. The day or two after it happened, James Okeefe was on Sean Hannity, with his lawyer talking about this. And 2 weeks after I provided the vials to Carrie Madej and Veritas. So to me, I'm like, does this really have to do with the diary? And it's just a question I've been always asking after the fact. And to me, it's just a huge red flag. It was a massive excuse that they used to keep me silent. And then they basically said, but you're really good at undercover work. So do you want to work for us? Because they hung that out there for me, basically, because they knew that I was so miserable working at Pfizer. They knew I basically suicided my entire pharmaceutical career. They knew what I did. And so they were throwing me an olive branch, essentially throwing me a bone. And I took that in a sense of, it was a slap in the face, honestly, to tell you the truth, Josh, but it was this blessing in disguise, because being the 23-year-old naive scientist that I was, I didn't have the computer background or anything else really to back up my SD cards and everything else. So that's where this whole hard drive comes into play, in the sense that Project Veritas right now is holding on to a hard drive that has all this footage that we discussed. And so your audience might be wondering, well, then how did you get the footage if you didn't have it when you left Pfizer? Well, that's where the whole double agent thing comes into play, where I went to go essentially look at Project Veritas through a lens that nobody else would. And I made a promise to God. I just prayed about it. I said, God, I promise I'm going to go get this Pfizer story back, and I'm going to redeem myself, and I'm going to redeem humanity. Because in my film, I say what ultimately happened to me. It was an injustice done to me, but it was an injustice done to the rest of the world, because crimes against humanity certainly were committed. People have absolutely been murdered, injured for the rest of their life, potentially, and certainly people can heal from these shots. It's just, sometimes the damage is so far gone that it's really debilitating, So it's so much culminating. So I hope that makes sense for the audience as they're following along.
Let's unpack some of that for them, because even myself, my mind went in 1,000 different directions when I got to that part of your documentary. And my first and foremost thought is, you knew what was going on after the fact, the same way any of us would have if we went through the situation, but it's very hard to recognize what's going on at the moment that it happens. So you get all of this information. The possibilities are endless as to why and how they are burying this, but we can deduce a couple things. One, they were scaring you into thinking that the consequences for all of this would fall back on you alone if they went forward with a story. That is one mechanism of control. James Okeefe, no matter who it was in that business at Project Veritas, who made the decision, whether it was a lawyer, whether it was him, whether it was the entire team, knew that they had information that was extremely damaging to Pfizer. If they had this on Pfizer, you could look at it a million different ways. One, they could have went to Pfizer and go, look at what we've got. And this is very, very, very valuable. Very valuable. So whether you want to believe that they went to Pfizer and demanded something on the back end, and then they took these steps to ensure that they were going to profit from it alone, or whether the FBI and Pfizer are working so coordinatedly together that they said, this is going nowhere, And if it were to go anywhere, Project Veritas would take the fall, or is Project Veritas just another extension of the entire apparatus? And yes, there's a lot of layers to this. It was a lot for me to unpack, and to put myself in your shoes going through it, brother, nobody else would have handled it any other way. You are at a point where you have to depend on these people that you've kind of partnered with to do the greater good. And they put you in a very vulnerable, very bad position that was not easy to understand until the back end. And no matter how you put the pieces together, your hands are tied. I mean, that was one of the first things I thought. I was like, dang, dude, I really feel for you, Justin. I really feel like I know that your heartstrings were pulled in one direction, but your choices were completely limited. And I've been in similar situations that were nowhere near the consequences, nowhere near the extremes of what you're going through. And I handle them very similarly. You process the information as you get it. And in hindsight, even if it's not 2020, we always understand things better. But let the audience know exactly what you deduced from that situation and why you thought you needed to look at Project Veritas.
I felt that there were too many red flags essentially adding up together. It's like, what are the odds that there's an FBI raid happening? What are the odds that they're not going to tell? What are the odds that they're not telling me about recording consent laws until the back end? Their excuse that I've heard since I've come out is that they wanted something more powerful than what I had already got. And I mean, they're sitting on it. It's the Nick Warren stuff, like saying that you were involved in gaming the FDA, essentially, combined with everything else that I was doing, combined with the microscope footage, to at least not raise questions as to what we saw that night is criminal. And so to me, it was just a massive snowball effect of, all right, like they're taking me out to Capitol Grill, spending like $700 on a dinner for me, but they're not going to move forward with the story that they also, Josh, in hindsight, after the release of this story, it's been corroborated that they spent about, I would say, at least $1 million on my Pfizer investigation based off the amount of journalists that they paid, with their salaries, putting me up in a hotel room several times. The whole microscope expose was probably a multi-$1,000 operation. So there was a lot to be lost in the sense of that investment. They threw $2 million in donor funds down the drain to not tell a Pfizer story that was ultimately going to lead to potentially opening up the eyes of maybe hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who are going to watch this story. And I mean, I've been told that what I did ultimately is the biggest story potentially in like the history of the world, or at least in maybe the last 100 years, in the sense of how hard I was willing to go to take down big pharma. It's just, they also have this network within the media. And then to the point that you're making, is Project Veritas potentially a front of some sort of operation? Are they, like I've said, FBI COINTEL Pro, counterintelligence pro? Is it that, a form of that? Washington Post has reported since I think 2016 that Project Veritas is linked to Blackwater, which is a private military contractor connected to Eric Prince, who Eric Prince right now is actually backing a lot of the Mammoth that we were just discussing. He backs Eric Prince. And I mean, it's funny enough, Ian Carroll went on Joe Rogan the other day talking about this phone thing, the phone, the black phone that they have that is like wiped of everything, supposedly, and so I actually have, befriended Amazing Polly, I think, on Twitter. I've followed her story, at least on how she talks about the narrative network. And ultimately, I find that all these people, the fact that they regurgitate each other's stories and are pretty much all pro-Trump, anyone who's not, and I've heard this, I had this discussion with some folks, of anyone who's not questioning the orange phallus, right? Big Daddy Trump is not to be trusted, at least in my eyes, and I'm not saying all Trump supporters are bad people or anything like that. Certainly not. I just think that it's about time that we hold the MAGA community, the Make America Health Again community accountable. I mean, what are we doing here? Like with these AI vaccines for cancer and, essentially it feels like this beast system is being presented to us in regards to cryptocurrency and all of that, which I don't know how far you want to go down that rabbit hole with me, but this is really all it leads into.
People need a hero, we will provide him. And it's a famous statement that's been made over and over again because it's turned out to be the absolute truth. Regardless of Trump, all right, Trump, we can look at a multitude of different ways. And like warp speed was one of those things where you could look at it from both sides of this equation, and we wouldn't probably be having this conversation without it, at least not for several more years, and the end of economies and all this other stuff. And whether or not the 4D chess is self-preservation or just pushing the can a little bit further down the road is, at this point, it doesn't really matter. What does matter, though, is that just like you had just touched on, if all of this web involves all of these pieces all the way throughout, from whistleblower level to well within the establishment of the federal government and these pharmaceutical giants, we're up against something that's unfathomable. And I think that was one of the thoughts that I had was, what are the chances that Project Veritas was not a honeypot, but an operation to extort money from these giants? Probably not that good, because if he did go up against Pfizer, I mean, I think Pfizer has the means, or any of these companies had the means to erase Project Veritas completely. So was he created just for that? And I know you touched on that possibility. I think you believed that possibility. And further down your own story, maybe that was confirmed for you by James Okeefe himself. So the FBI has this raid. Project Veritas comes to, whatever issues that they had internally that would push James out of the company. What made you go and follow James Okeefe to his new media group?
Well, so to backtrack slightly, it happened shortly after, and when I say it, James Okeefe leaving Project Veritas happened shortly after I had gotten the Jordan Tristan Walker, Pfizer's mutating COVID, the gain of fiction narrative story. Got like 50 million views in a week or two, right? The biggest story in company history in regards to views, and I believe also in regards to the amount of money that came in. This story got, I think, $1 million+ in donations relatively easily. It could have surpassed that amount. And then the whole thing and how that all plays out is, there was the second release of the fertility story, which they didn't want in the first release in regards to menstrual cycles and things of that nature being side effects of the vaccine. So that to me was actually the more important story because, as we've discussed, the whole virology versus the terrain model, I was in real time a terrain guy, so the fact that Jordan Tristan Walker's sitting there and telling me that Pfizer's mutating COVID, I knew it was going to be a big story based off of how narratives work. And to me, it was all just shiny propaganda, but I ultimately was doing a job, and that story itself is actually what led me to uncovering my footage again. It created this rapport with Project Veritas. And so I reobtained that in late January, right? And then there was the second release. And then shortly after those stories came out, I believe it was late February, early March is when James had left the company essentially. And/or the whole thing is the and/or, because no one really knows. Project Veritas says that James left on his own and James said he was fired. So really, what happened to everybody? And I assert that I don't know the full story, but what I can share is that when Project Veritas was essentially crumbling, when they're coming out with this letter, right, that 17 people signed or so, basically making all these accusations against James, I was late to find out about the whole thing. I found out about this letter about a day or two prior, and then it got leaked to, the mainstream alternative media groups, basically. And they're talking about how Project Veritas has a leaker, has someone out to get James. And to me, there's people who stayed at Project Veritas that I may not be friendly with anymore, but at the time we were talking about, is James in on leaking this? Is that's certainly a possibility. James could have been the leaker, or there could have been multiple leakers. who were ultimately leading this information out so that Project Veritas looked bad, and they're kicking their CEO out, the guy who essentially is the face of the organization. It was just a big red flag, this whole entire situation. And from my perspective, I would say that it's entirely possible that James was leaking stuff, as well as others were leaking stuff, say to like Gateway Pundit and, Post Millennial or whoever else. I forget the organizations that had these leaks, but I think it's entirely possible James was involved, as well as the board, like working with the board to essentially help destroy Project Veritas, because, they just got millions of dollars in donations. Who knows? I'm just asking questions. I'm not affirming anything, but ultimately he went to go to Okeefe Media Group, and I was given an opportunity to go to OMG, and I took it and ran with it because I felt called essentially to go continue to corroborate my Pfizer story. And I knew it was this risky thing to do in the sense that I had just obtained the footage from Conwall, so I had that and I was sitting on it, but I was looking for something else. I was looking for more. And sure enough, the second day on the job at OMG, I got transcripts from Pfizer and I got the Ramin footage. Believe it or not, it's just how it worked. I think it was March, April, something like that of 2023. I was like, okay, this is the second piece. This is more evidence showing that it was just more than a one-time thing of me on the inside doing what I was doing. And the transcripts were great. And I just was like, all right, there's like something else missing here, it seems. I don't necessarily think that these people that I'm working with are fully legitimate in a way. I really was questioning every single person that I worked with, unfortunately, which I get into in my documentary. Is I was working very closely with Alicia Gamble Nightingale, who is a great undercover journalist that I worked with for about 2 years. She worked with me when I was a Pfizer whistleblower source. She loved me, and I still love her. I have heart space for her, but we have this disagreement in the sense that her husband, Brian, is connected to General Michael Flynn, who is also part of this narrative network, supposedly, like America Project. And, he actually had, I did OSINT, what OSINT is, it's open source intelligence, right? I did journalism, and I went and researched my old colleagues after I had resigned from working at OMG, because I had this hunch, and I worked with the co-producer, and I showed him some of this information regarding Brian Gamble being at January 6th in SWAT gear, if you recall from the film. And once I came across all of this, I was like, okay, this is insane. Like, was this really a massive intelligence operation against me?
Were they using you in a massive intelligence operation?
Well, hindsight's 2020. I've had some friends, after I tell them my whole story, they're like, Justin, it seems like you could have actually been being breadcrumbed into essentially being trained to be some version of CIA, essentially, which it's entirely possible. I was learning intelligence itself. Intelligence is, exactly what I was doing in a way, but that's all about putting out these narratives in the alternative media. That Jordan Tristan Walker story itself is an intelligence operation from my perspective, right? It's journalism, but it's also part of an intelligence operation that was meant to subconsciously affirm viruses being mutated on the entire world. That's where that was so heavy on my heart.
Do you think you possibly failed a test? Do you know what I mean by that?
Did I fail a test?
In other words, did you have too high of a moral standard to actually get kind of invited a little bit further into this?
It's possible. It's entirely possible. The whole thing with the Bohemian Grove confrontation, I just had to walk away after James Okeefe told me he went to BG. So
go one step back. You had just touched on something that was extremely enlightening. They allowed part of your work to hit the mainstream, to get an insanely large audience, to go viral. But it was just one part of something that would prop up a narrative that you didn't believe to be true. And then they buried what could have possibly, whether it was obtained legally or illegally, buried liability exemption for all manufacturers of vaccines. And my takeaway from the documentary was one of the biggest things that RFK spoke about it, whether or not you believe his intentions are full on to get the job done. Other people have spoke about this exemption, this liability exemption that they have, and how to get rid of that for good. This information, if it were to go mainstream, would have the public demanding that liability exemption disappear overnight. So they bury that part of your story, that part of your work, and they allow this other part, which go ahead and reaffirm the virus / biolab, all these theories that we have come to believe or even know are nonsense. You took that away in real time?
Yeah, absolutely. When I went forward with this story, I was doing a job, but I ultimately, the fact that I saw how quickly this thing blew up, I said, oh my gosh, I wish I could take this back right now. I knew I played into their hand. I essentially felt manipulated into it. But like some of my colleagues knew how I felt about virology too. Like they heard me say before, like, guys, viruses don't even exist. But they let this come forward. And I'll even say Alicia Nightingale, we've had the conversation about terrain before, but she was also saying how proud of me she was that this story was coming out. And I just was so conflicted the entire time. I'm like, I'm living in 3 different matrices all at once, you know, like my home me, my work me, and then I'm just going insane as me, you know, because nothing was in alignment. It felt, you know, everything was upside down as to how I felt it should be, you know, and that's not to like force my story or agenda on everyone. It's just like, I'm all about truth and love, you know, like let's talk about the truth versus sprinkle in a ton of lies with some great clicky sound bites and in a sit down interview where we demoralize this guy, Jordan Walker, and ruin his life basically, you know, I mean, I wouldn't say his life is necessarily ruined, but he's a scapegoat for Pfizer when ultimately it's this guy was a consultant through Boston Consulting Group and worked at Pfizer for I don't know how long it was, but I mean, he's not the evil doer that James Okeefe, Project Veritas make it out to be. From my perspective, the whole thing with this directed evolution narrative is definitely interesting in the sense of, you know, taking this mRNA and mutating the human genome, which also has not been isolated ever. We can get into that in the sense that we don't understand DNA and RNA or really any of this stuff. You know, we just act like we do. You know, they're really all backed on theory.
With that said, do you think there's any level of understanding that we don't have in the mainstream that is driving this maniacal push? I mean, is there possibly something there that we don't understand yet that's actually transhuman / evil / damaging to the human species in general?
In regards to this mRNA technology, you're saying? I look at the big picture first and foremost in the sense that I know that this thing is a toxic poison that you should not be putting in your body. And I stand on that before I really dig into the potential of there being graphene oxide or anything else. Because, the nanotechnology, the self-assembling microchips or things of that nature. My answer on that is I don't know. You know, I don't know if that's happening inside the body because the body is also a brilliant creation that is able to essentially combat toxins and poisons that, you know, we're combating things every day, you know, in the air, for example. My whole thing is I just pretty much say it's a toxic poison bomb that you should be putting in your body. But I will also say that it's entirely possible that there is some version of nanotechnology. Jason Christoff wrote an article about how this could have been Elon Musk's Neuralink, and they put it into people, and they just unknowingly have consented to this. Is that possible? It sure could be. My big thing is I don't know, but the whole thing is it's really interesting because when you look at the vials like they would glow. You know, I put it up against a black wall with a light coming down in this thing. It was not clear. You know, it's not like it was saline. It was legitimately glowing. I ultimately attribute that to the lipid nanoparticles.
Luciferase?
And yes, the luciferase technology, whatever that is, you know, with black lights being shown on people's arms and showing up in people's veins. it's obviously a huge rabbit hole, and I can't necessarily affirm anything. But when I was seeing that in real time, it's all a culmination of it's at least plausible from my perspective, and it certainly is injuring people. My whole thing with the drug delivery system is that there are patents that have this drug delivery technology with telephoresis, which is what Dr. Carrie Madej was talking about when she went on Stu Peters' show, which it creates these carbon nanotubes in our body, essentially, which from my perspective, it ultimately feels like it's essentially hardening our arteries and veins, and it's going to just cause these clots. Is it ultimately delivering drugs? I'm not sure.
Or is it just...
It's ultimately just a clot shot. This thing is meant to cause havoc in your body. So it's going to clot you. It's going to give you a turbo cancer, essentially, because it's just going to cause massive inflammation throughout your body. And you should not be putting it in you, is the bottom line conclusion that I've come from. Not just COVID shots, but it's every single shot. And it's not even just vaccines. It's literally everything.
So what do you tell people that still take the flu shot?
Stop. Blank. I mean, or ask them, have you looked at the ingredients of what is in that? Trying to plead with people. And then, I still have friends from my childhood who will go and take these things. And to me, it's not really a slap in the face anymore. It's just people are literally just turning a blind eye against truth. They'd rather buy the lie again and again and again.
It's not easy to admit that you were deceived or that your entire reality is inverted. So you go to OMG and the tables turn again. Fill us in. How'd it happen?
So I worked at Okeefe Media Group for about 5 months, and I was doing undercover journalism while James is pushing this new idea. He was in love with this idea of creating a citizen journalism army, which is already what Project Veritas essentially was doing in a way. It's just, James was trying to make it as big as possible, as fast as possible. So my role sort of changed. I was still doing undercover journalism, doing the swiping on the Bumbles and Tinders and things of that nature. But I was also working heavily in Twitter DMs and Instagram DMs of his main accounts and working to bring in new citizen journalists. And ultimately, it's funny, the idea actually, I think, ultimately stemmed from me coming from Pfizer and being able to get his 50 million views story, right? He was in love with how big that story got. So he wanted to replicate it with other people that are just out there for James to make this big map and say, oh, let's get a story in Washington, D.C. And, how many people are in D.C. that are conservative and willing to go film for James Okeefe? Probably a good amount of people, or California, Florida, if you do the right thing with the right coaching, right? Don't break recorded consent, you'll be fine. So that's how the first 4 or 5 months ultimately were playing out at Okeefe Media Group. Did get one story actually in DC on Fox News, and it was linked to Tucker Carlson. And then it really, late June is when I started hearing the rumblings of what was really going down, and that was Bohemian Grove. And my old colleague, Julie, resigned due to hearing about this. She was like, I'm done. I'm out of here. I can't do this anymore. Told me after she resigned that, by the way, James, did you hear James was going to Bohemian Grove this summer? And I said, I was not aware, but thanks for the heads up. And ultimately, it was the second time I had heard about Bohemian Grove. And I will say that I might have subconsciously went to go to Okeefe Media Group really to go investigate this Bohemian Grove thing, because there was an all hands meeting when I was at Project Veritas, and I forget the exact timing. I forget the exact timing, so I won't say it. But James put in a Microsoft Teams chat saying, should I go to Bohemian Grove? In our Microsoft, general discussion. It was a general discussion. He's like, yes or no. And I believe it was 90% no and 10% said yes. And they were like, if you're going to go, do what Alex Jones did, basically. Right. So that would have been cool. I mean, I would have been for that, yes. And if you were just going to go investigate the bad guys, like doing it like Alex Jones did, but that's not why he went. And so, that all, I guess, subconsciously played out. I heard about Bohemian Grove again in late June at this time. I brought it up to my colleagues. I said, I know James gone to Bohemian Grove. Like, he went to a donor meeting in Seattle right before this encampment. And then Seattle is not too far from Northern California. One thing led to another. And James said in our last team call before he flew to Seattle, I will be off grid. I will not have my phones. I need you all to be posting. I'm going to this all men's business retreat. And I'm just like, dude, rolling my eyes in the back of my head. Like, how does he not expect this to come out? So I actually, that's where that quote comes from. My documentary is a meeting with the entire team at OMG prior to James going to Bohemian Grove. And so he went, the whole week goes by. Nothing is mentioned about Bohemian Grove by anybody. We're all just like, where's James? Right? Like, kind of laughing about it. And then ultimately he comes back in August, and I was able to obtain a tent slip that says Bohemian Grove at the top, and it says James Okeefe, and that is James's handwriting, I believe, from my understanding. And there was actually a letter too next to James's book. And I wish, hindsight's 2020. I wish I took a picture of the whole letter versus just having his signature next to it. But I was also basically, pooping my pants. I was like, this is insane. I was like, this is crazy. This is a Bohemian Grove tent slip. Like, this is, what more evidence of bombshell story do I need to tell the world of like what's going on in the alternative media world? Like Pfizer whistleblower getting subverted into doing undercover journalism that, and now Bohemian Grove, right? Like, with this king of investigative journalism, like, it doesn't really add up. Like, James is the exposer of everything in the mainstream eyes, even, people are like, James Okeefe, he's not ethical, this and that. He's this right-wing influencer who exposes left-wingers. Well, I didn't get invited to this big high-end secret society, essentially, So I took those pictures as I went to the bathroom, like I was saying, at his house in New Jersey. And then I went on a vacation. I said, I'm out of here. I need to, take a break from the alternative media world for a little bit. I went to the Music and Sky conference where I actually got to meet Alex Zek, Mike Winner, Amanda Vollmer, all the lovely people in the freedom community after the release at the end of COVID. And I ultimately went there just to tell them, guys, I'm real and I'm like dealing with stuff. Like, I told my story to a lot of people. I couldn't shut up about it. And I ended up meeting Marty Leeds, my co-producer of the documentary Project Whistleblower, where Marty said, hey, I'll do a documentary for you for free and I'll help you put it all together, because he could tell that my story is just so large and so big that, and very traumatizing in a way that, like, for me to just go and put this whole thing together, and it would probably leave out certain cracks, and it just needed to be filtered through an actual producer, someone who's competent and capable of telling a story like the way that Project Whistleblower does. And so then when, I met Marty, and then I flew back home, and then I was on the job, and I'm like hearing that James Okeefe wants to talk to you. And I said, all right, talk to me tomorrow. I don't want to talk to you today. So I was on the Monday, I got back, and I got back to James on Tuesday, and I knew the confrontation of Bohemian Grove was coming, because my colleagues, who I mentioned in my film, Alicia and Jasper, confronted James about Bohemian Grove. And so they put the red flag up to him saying, hey, like, what were you doing there? And so, that's where, I certainly love them for doing that. And, they won't talk to me, unfortunately, because of how I portrayed my film and told my truth. But I just told the truth like it was, so I have heart space for them that one day maybe we can rekindle our friendship. Regardless, they confronted James, and then I ultimately knew it was coming. And then James basically said the famous words, I went to this Bohemian club. I want to see how you're feeling, see how you're doing, does this vibe with you basically? And I was just like, dude, like, isn't this a black veil honeypot operation that is, used to take people that have some power and just, turn them against their actual mission? And, that's where I flipped. On that phone call, it was either you stay undercover and you expose this at another point in time, or you reveal your true colors and you tell James how you really feel about how, Pfizer played out, how I went all the way from being a Pfizer whistleblower to getting manipulated, subverted into a job offer, and ultimately culminating in, getting his biggest story ever, being one of his top tier journalists, and then being told that he went to Bohemian Grove and I'm expected to not use my critical thinking skills and be hard on him. He was in my phone call. He's like, I feel like my own team's listening me and questioning me, and that just can't be a thing. It's like, well, why? Shouldn't you be transparent? Like, why did you go, James? That's the reality of the situation. Like, his LLC is literally called Transparency One LLC. That's what Okeefe Media Group actually is. And he was not transparent. And that, therefore, I resigned. As I resigned, and my other colleagues, I believe, were resigned/fired, and some of them took a severance package. I refused it. I was offered like $30,000 to $40,000 worth in severance package. And I certainly could have used that money
to sign an NDA.
Essentially, I didn't even read it. I didn't want to look at it. I said, that is dirty money. That is Bohemian Grove money. I don't even want to look at your severance package because I don't want to compromise myself. I certainly am not perfect, and I've certainly sinned in the past. And that, to me, would certainly have just dug more into, accepting dirty money. I didn't need that in my life. And that's why I resigned. And I said, no, I don't want your dirty money. And then it took 7 or 8 months really to produce my story. And ultimately people might wonder, like, Justin, why did you not come out sooner with this information? Why didn't you just release the footage with Conwall and Ramin and just call it a day? Why did you have to expose James? Why did you have to make it so you're exposing your colleagues even that you worked with and questioning their own legitimacy? Well, the reason I had to tell the story this way is because no one really would have believed me from my perspective on just how big this operation potentially was and how I see it. My story is not for everybody. And certainly if I left certain parts out, right, like the part about Operation Mockingbird and my colleagues and everything else, I certainly could have potentially gotten to Alex Jones and on InfoWars. That wasn't my goal of this, though. My goal was to tell the truth and share the story like it was told. And that's how it's played out, And so for those reasons, it's definitely been suppressed as well, Josh. Like, I think it's gotten to probably 260 or 70,000 views on Rumble, which isn't bad, but certainly this story is capable to reach the millions in regards to views. And it's potentially reached that at this point in time in regards to people hearing about my story at this point, based off of I had a tweet recently go viral, tweeting about at Elon Musk and Trump and RFK Jr. saying, pull these shots, they're poison, and Slay News is a truth-telling news organization. They reported on it, and the story, my tweet was reported on, which is great, but it ultimately doesn't do my story justice either, in the sense of how I was so suppressed. And, people in the comments are like, dude, it's been 4 years. Where have you been? I'm like, well, dude, I tried doing all this in late 2021. Go check out my documentary and make the decision for yourself. And that's ultimately where the whole just integrity thing comes in, because I just want people to know that I stand in my own integrity. I'm not perfect by any means, and I can admit I'm wrong. And it does break my heart that I can't, or not even can't, but like I certainly have created a divide even in the old colleagues that I used to work with. Like, they were like some of my best friends, and they won't talk to me anymore. And so, but I ultimately stand for the truth, and so it was tough decisions that I've had to make through all of this, and one big question is like, why did this happen? to me. Why did God choose me to go through something like this and essentially awaken myself, I guess? I don't know. I'm still discovering all that, but it's...
Well, with such a big question, you're not going to have the answer to that overnight, for sure. And if you think about it, you really did tell the story well in your documentary. And when you think about the magnitude of Operation of Mockingbird, they knew they were losing the grasp on the minds of men that they had worked for so long and so hard to establish. And these alternative voices that were coming out organically, some were co-opted, and then it was a logical step that some would be created, some would be processed, some would be manufactured. And obviously, in my opinion, I can't look at this any other way, besides some of these were manufactured, and good people like yourself went through those stages and through those layers of gatekeepers and suppression. So not only were they co-opting your work, but of course, when you separate yourself from that establishment, they're going to suppress your word and your absolute proof, your definitive, entire process from public access. And you mentioned Borla earlier. I had a monetized account on TikTok, and I put his words up, him speaking his words up, and that got my account ripped. I had YouTube videos when I started this podcast that mentioned the procedure, the thing, and those were ripped. And I was such a small voice. I was so insignificant, and I still am. And it just, at the time, it didn't make any sense. And I was like, wow, man, they've really built a really good AI filtering system to just crush any dissent from the narrative. So of course, if you have something as strong and as powerful and as proof and definitive as what you have, you're going to be up against an absolute onslaught, an army. And bro, I am super grateful for all of the process that you've gone through, from standing out there in the rain on your own and really weathering the storm. But I don't expect it to be overnight either. COVID happened like yesterday to all of us. Last night I was with one of my best friends, and he was like, dude, you realize it's been 5 years? And I was like, yeah, it feels like 5 minutes ago, doesn't it? So
Yeah, timelines are accelerated, I suppose, but I mean, COVID ultimately was a blessing in disguise to all of us too, that chose the awakening side versus chose mainstream, which is, it's obviously dark, but, there's the Freemason term, dark to light or whatever, and it certainly was a blessing, but it was also an attack on humanity. It really was. So, to have been in that part of the realm, like I was in the Viper pit, essentially. I was legitimately in the front lines of where it all was. And to come out unharmed at this point in time is remarkable. I mean, I thank God every day that I have a vessel still to share this story. And like we were talking about earlier, sometimes I have to dissociate a little bit from what I've actually done and just enjoy life versus like being so strapped into, Bohemian Grove, Pfizer, James Okeefe, and certainly I get tapped in when I do podcasts and everything again, but the nature of my story is very heavy. And so, I ask the audience and even myself to just provide myself grace because, I don't like living in a black pill. I ultimately subscribe to calling it a white pill in the sense of, look, your idolatry of Trump, James Okeefe, Alex Jones, the alternative media talking heads, any politician, it's all wrong. All, Alex Zek, Mark Gober, all these folks in the freedom community have woken me up to appealing to authority and even in pointing out logical fallacies and pretty much all the way of mainstream thinking and subscribing to the fact that we need to take back our autonomy. We need to take back our own authority as men and women on this earth. What makes a police officer better than me or a lawmaker better than me? It's literally their monopoly character. That's basically what this is. It's all one big game. And if we all choose to stand up, then it's done. We can co-create a better system. It's just the communication of it all and ultimately creating that foundation is not easy, and it certainly does not happen overnight. It's going to take probably 5, 10, 15 years ultimately for some coordinated system ultimately to come together like that. But I say, like my friend Mike says, I'll leave his last name out of it. My friend Mike told me that we're here to plant seeds, and we might not even be able to see the trees that grow from it, but just we got to continue to keep planting seeds. And so I hope my story has planted seeds for your audience. If they haven't heard of me before, I hope they've learned something from my human experience, because certainly that's the real reason behind all of this, is to get this story and this weight off my chest, but ultimately for people to see the alternative media, see big pharma through a lens that they probably never really would have if I decided to essentially not take the job opportunity at Pfizer, or essentially stayed at Pfizer and just worked there for 3 more years, like it's all this crazy journey I've been on. And I really hope your audience decides to check out my documentary at justintegrity.net. Again, it's called Project Whistleblower. You can find it on Rumble, BitChute, and find it on Twitter, probably snippets of it. And if you guys want to follow me, you can find me on Instagram at justin.leslie3, and my Twitter/X. I like to say Twitter still because X is like, subscribing to the Antichrist system or whatever. But justintegrity_ is my X handle. And yeah, I really appreciate you having me on, Josh. I know you run about an hour, so I know we're going a little over, but
well, I wasn't really worried about it. I was happy to get it out there, but I want you to know too, this is the silver lining, brother. This dialogue is the silver lining. It's happening over and over and over again. That entire community that you just mentioned, Mark Goober, Alex Check, Jacob Diaz, all of the truthers out there about virology, all of these conversations that are being had are the silver lining. It's not about the establishment that we're taking over, that we're willing to take down or trying to take down, or what we're trying to replace it with. It's the fact that more and more people are talking about these things. And 5-6 years ago, I couldn't bring up 9/11 without people losing their minds when I would suggest it was not what we were told. So
yeah, man. I mean, we could talk about 9/11 for probably 45 minutes.
So many of these different subjects, for sure.
Loose change and whatever else, were the planes even CGI? I don't know, dude.
Yeah,
it's possible.
I just watched another really good documentary on it the other day. I'll talk to you about it later off the air. But thank you so much for joining me. And yeah, that was
Absolutely,
a teaser.
Josh.
Maybe we'll have to have part 2 about some of this other stuff at some point.
Yeah, certainly, if you want to have me back on, I'd love to. And I'll be making the rounds again, probably on some other shows that I've been on, as I look forward to continue doing journalism. Like I was saying, while we were talking offline, I'm doing my multiple hat wearing role again, where I've jumped into the realm of healing, actually, and pursuing the skill of chiropractic, and also still living in this paradigm of journalism and truth telling. So it's an interesting being me right now, in the sense of, I'm this Pfizer whistleblower who's back in school, and, dude, I'm learning about the construct essentially that is being presented of like biochemistry and everything else. I'm like, is this all nonsense too?
Well, you're young and you've already have the Forrest Gump story. I like to tell people that's a little bit of what my life has been. It's been all over the place, but especially specializing in one little thing is for bugs anyway. So
yeah, right.
Good on you.
It's all just be the main character of your own movie, basically. So
be a Renaissance man, engage all of it. Everything you're interested in, pursue it, do it.
Yeah. Well, much love to you, Josh. Once again, for the audience, it's justintegrity.net. I'm sure we can put that in the show notes or something. And we've said it like 3 or 4 times. So
we'll do, definitely.
Much love to you, Josh. Appreciate you having me on, dude.
Thanks for joining me, brother.